Hi everyone. So in this section, we're going to be talking about the idea of a working memory system. And so this is a model that was developed by a researcher by the name of Baddeley. And basically what Baddeley thought is that he didn't see working memory as a single entity. Instead, he rather saw it as a system. And so as part of the system, there were a couple different parts. And as was represented here, basically Baddeley saw this as, at least in his original model, as a three-part system. So there was a central executive, which is demonstrated here by the circle, and then there were two other components to it, the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop. And so the idea of the central executive is basically it served as the big boss, right? So things might be happening in the visual spatial sketchpad, other things might be happening in the phonological loop, and the job of the central executive was to basically manage the things that were happening in these two different subsystems, or as I call it here, components, but also to combine information between the two of them and also selectively attend. So either attend to the phonological loop or the visual spatial sketchpad. So the role of the central executive, much like when we talked about it in the case of just general cognitive functioning, in this case, the central executive basically takes information from both of these different components that it's attached to, and it organizes this information. It's responsible for saying, do I attend to the phonological loop or do I attend to the visual spatial sketchpad? Now, as far as the component systems, again, at least in the original model, and I'll come back to that idea in a second, but in the original model, the visual spatial sketchpad was basically the form of working memory where we either consider the spatial relationship of objects or we consider what it might look like in kind of a visual representation, hence the name visual spatial. And so one of the best ways to kind of communicate this to students based on their own experience is if you think about where you might be trying to remember, for example, in the memory game, or in the card game Memory, where you have different cards that are turned over, and what you need to do is flip those cards over and try to find two matching pairs. One of the things that people typically do in that is they think about the spatial relationship of cards. So say that they know where one of the cards is, and the person that they're playing against reveals that matching card in that. What basically people are doing is they're organizing in space where those particular matching cards might be so that they can, when it's their turn, match those cards together. So that would be an example of how we might kind of store information spatially in working memory and the spatial relationship of things. Another example of this is if you just kind of imagine a room that you're not in at the moment. So if you imagine your living room at home, assuming you're not there, and you think about the spatial relationship of that, that would be an example of kind of working with the spatial component of the visual spatial sketchpad. Now, it can also handle information that you might draw down on like a piece of paper. So if you really do think of it as just a scratch piece of paper where you might put information temporarily just in order to be able to hold on to that information and kind of keep it in working memory. So you can really kind of think of this visual spatial sketchpad as literally a sketch pad where you might sketch information, the spatial relationship to it, or you might just kind of, for example, a lot of times when I'm thinking of phone numbers, I think of a visual representation as if they were written down on a sheet of paper or something like that. That would be information that's being worked on in working memory in the visuospatial sketchpad. Now, the opposite of that is something called the phonological loop. And the phonological loop is like the auditory version of the visual spatial sketchpad. And the phonological loop, basically this is like having a tape recorder where you can kind of tape record either notes to yourself or information to yourself. And the way that this represents information is in an auditory format. So as opposed to the example that I gave where people might be remembering a phone number and it's kind of like written down on a piece of scratch paper, in the phonological loop, the way that you may kind of be working on that working memory or whatever it is that you're trying to remember is that you may be hearing kind of an auditory representation of it, like it's on a digital recorder of some sort, and you're just playing back that phone number, the sound of that phone number over and over and over again. So that's the visual spatial sketchpad and the phonological loop. Visual spatial is kind of dealing with visual information, phonological loop dealing with auditory information, and then the role of the central executive is to organize how that information might be stored, combine it in the case of examples where we may be relying both on visual spatial information and phonological information, depending on what the working memory task is, and also to selectively attend to which one might be important. Kind of as I demonstrated just talking about this in the case of a phone number, right? We could really represent that phone number both ways, and maybe for a person, they tend to remember things in working memory better if it's in an auditory format as opposed to a visual format, right? And so in this case, the central executive may selectively attend to the phonological loop as opposed to the visual spatial sketchpad. So that's the original model that Baddeley developed. Now, over time, that model eventually got adapted, and they added a third component to it. And this third component is called an episodic buffer. And I don't really have it represented in this particular example, but the idea is basically you could imagine a third box on here. And the purpose of the episodic buffer is to put things into chronological order. So for example, if we're to think about a particular memory and how that memory unfolded as we're working on it, such as the order of numbers in the phone number or something like that, it's the episodic buffer that's responsible for putting those numbers in chronological or the appropriate order so that we make sure that we call the correct phone number. Another example from the episodic buffer, and this kind of comes from my own experience, but I like to work on bikes, right? And one of the, it's like working on cars or working on technical equipment like computers or anything like that. But one of the important things is as you're tearing apart whatever that device is, you have to remember the order in which the objects came off, so that when it comes time to put that object back together, you make sure that you put the last piece that you took off first, and so on and so forth. And it's really kind of thinking about the ordering in time with the episodic buffer and how things occur in time that are handled by the episodic buffer. So that's Baddeley's working memory system. Big important things to keep in mind here is that it's at least as we've described it here, a four-piece system. There's the visual spatial sketchpad, phonological loop, an episodic buffer that handle spatial visual information, auditory information, and then also chronological or time-based information, respectively. And then there's the central executive, much like we talked about earlier, that basically kind of is the big boss of those three different component systems and organizes them to make them work the most effective for working memory. So that's the Baddeley's working memory system. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to use the parking lot forum or drop me an email and let me know.